For those of you who are just joining us, I'm just getting onto the watch page to be able to post the G-chat. If you're looking for the handout, it's already up. It should be at kahaljoseph.org/ShabbatMatters.html. You can also find it in the calendar section of our website. I'm just going into the edit page of the event itself, Shabbat Matters number 6, and I'm adding the G-chat. That link that's in there is the G-chat. And I actually have to get out of the page so to avoid it having some feedback that I don't want it to have. So if all of you should be with us, oh yeah, we even have someone watching. Excellent. Welcome. And what I'm going to do is just open up the file that's from the website. It's called Shabbat Matters 6, Cooking and Travel. And we're just going to jump right into it. It's being recorded, as I have done with the past several classes. If you'd like to participate in the G-chat, you'd be more than welcome. I'd be happy to hear from you. You can ask me questions by typing them onto the screen. I should be able to see that. You should also be able to participate with your face and your voice however you like. You can also just listen, and the class is being recorded. So please do be advised that if you participate in a way that we can see, that will become part of the recording. And that way other people are able to follow as well. So here we have, is that practical? Cooking and transportation. Last week we got cut off at the very end, and I have not yet learned how to splice in video to an existing video feed, but we got pretty close. And if you look at the handout from last time, which I'll just pull up, number 5, Melacha, to remind myself, you'll see that there's actually quite a bit there. The source that says Mishnah Shabbat 7.2 is 39 labors. Each one involves several what's called toladot, which are outgrowths of that particular labor. So for example, we're going to talk about cooking today. We'll see that cooking includes baking and frying and a number of other things that are not necessarily part of bishul, which is a stovetop liquid type of cooking. So there was an awful lot there. Many different types of work. Some things that we might never think to do on Shabbat, like slaughtering an animal. Perhaps we don't slaughter them during the week either, primarily. So I didn't know that it would occur to us to slaughter it or skin it or salt the hide or tan it or smooth it on Shabbat. But we can see that some of those activities might actually be involved in things that we do on an everyday basis. A congregant of mine recently asked me about roll-on deodorant, like a deodorant bar. And it's a pretty well-accepted view in modern Orthodoxy that putting the deodorant in your underwear is akin to smoothing the hide of a slaughtered animal, and that therefore it's not recommended on Shabbat. And we recommend a spray deodorant if you're concerned about your scent on the Sabbath. There's always a way to do things, but it turns out that even something that's about slaughtering an animal has an effect. Just as we don't smooth the hide, we don't smooth the surface of anything on Shabbat. And so it can seem overwhelming. The reason I'm bringing up a little bit from last time is you end up thinking, geez, there's so many things to remember. There's so many things that we could do that would send us down the wrong path. I want to make sure that I'm observing Shabbat. And the way that Rabbi Malhado explained it, it's crazy. I can't do it. So that's a normal reaction. And many people do find it overwhelming. But on the other hand, there's a way to do an awful lot of things on Shabbat that wouldn't necessarily interfere so terribly in your life. So we mentioned the deodorant example. There's more than one kind of deodorant, so we'd simply use a different type of deodorant. There's a lot of small adjustments that can be made that actually don't really involve something so terrible. One of the questions that I had in rabbinical school was, on Shabbat exam when I was being tested on my own knowledge of the laws of Shabbat. Had to do with a recipe that was carefully selected by the staff, a recipe for guacamole. And this recipe just incidentally involved some things that I don't think anybody writing a recipe for guacamole would have even noticed an issue with some of these things. But small instructions in the preparation of the guacamole that would cause it to become forbidden on the Sabbath. And the whole point of this exam question was take this recipe that in multiple levels is forbidden, identify all the areas in which it has a forbidden action on Shabbat, and then recommend a remedy. And after your remedy, you will see that it's actually totally easy to make guacamole on Shabbat, that is permitted. So you start out thinking, oh man, if every time I try to make guacamole, I'm going to have to be thinking like this. It seems crazy. On the other hand, you could look at it as not such a big deal, a small adjustment, and I get my guacamole. No problem. So one of the examples of that, we talked last time about selection, and we defined selection as selection of an unwanted part of a food from the desired part of food. So if you had, say, a bowl of oranges and apples, and you wanted to eat the apples, to remove all of the oranges so that you're left with a bowl of apples is forbidden on Shabbat. And so this recipe for guacamole called for removing the skin of the avocado. Okay, so you shouldn't do that on Shabbat. But what was the remedy? It's so easy. Cut the thing in half and scoop the part of the avocado that you want out of the inside shell that you don't want. Now the result is the same. You're working with the meat of the avocado, and through a small change in how you access that meat, you're able to work with it just fine. So the take-home that I would make is that although you do have to be aware of a number of problems and issues and rules on Shabbat about how to prepare food in particular, but any number of other actions, you're right, you do need to be aware of all that. But on the other hand, it's doable, it's accessible, it's actually something that the common person can wrap their mind around, and it's actually not a big deal. Once you learn it and get inside of it to make these minor adjustments, you can have a perfectly normal Sabbath experience without making yourself crazy with these rules. And so I want to talk about two particularly big issues in the laws of Shabbat, and that has to do with food preparation and movement around the cityscape on the Sabbath. These are issues that really, in terms of modern life, we have so many ways to prepare food. There's so many ways to move around. And in fact, our lives are now set up in such a way that we depend on being able to make food that way and being able to move around that way in order to lead what is reckoned to be a normal life. We need cars, we need appliances, we need a lot of things to do what we do during the week to be able to be functional on Shabbat in some manner. And if you do it the way that you did during the week, you're going to have a problem on Shabbat. And so these two in particular are probably more current, more relevant to people's daily life and their experience of Shabbat than some of the other ones. So I want to start with cooking, and we should spend about half the time on that, maybe a little more, and we'll move to travel, which will be a little bit less than half the time, and hopefully we'll still be finished around 9 o'clock, give or take, about 10 minutes. So the first source I have here is from the Rambam. I'm just reminding if anyone joined us lately, which, let's see, yeah, somebody did. For the people who have joined us lately on the class, if you go to kahaljoseph.org/shabbat-matters.html, which on the website, if you just go to the calendar tab, or maybe it's a calendar tab, I have to look at it, kahaljoseph.org, it's going to load, I'll do it myself. And you go to, the calendar tab, Shabbat Matters is one of the things that pulls down, and you can download the handout there. We'll be using that handout for the rest of the class. The first source at the top of page 1 is from the Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, and he wrote a book called the Mishneh Torah. It's 14 books, each with subchapters about all the rules of Judaism. And one substantial section is about the laws of Shabbat. It has many chapters. And in chapter 9, he addresses a number of things having to do with food. So here's what he says. He's interested in establishing what's called a she'ur. A she'ur literally means a measurement, but in this case, it means a minimum measurement for which you're going to get yourself in trouble. So how much food do you have to cook on the Sabbath before you've violated the Sabbath? We mentioned last week that cooking, it was actually under the heading of baking. Baking on the Sabbath is forbidden because they had to do baking in order to prepare certain elements. We talked about it last time of the Holy Tabernacle. And therefore, because of that, we don't cook on the Sabbath because we're resting from all the things we rested from when we built the tabernacle. So now, no cooking on Shabbat. How much do we have to cook before we're liable? And when he says liable, it's hayav, obligated. That's what this word means. What are you hayav? You're hayav hatat. You're obligated or liable in bringing a sin offering. What's the minimum amount? It is kigrogeret, the amount of a size of food, the shape of a small fig, is 1 grogeret worth of food. If you were to cook or bake or fry an even smaller piece of food, a morsel of food, then although that is also forbidden on Shabbat, it's not forbidden from the Torah. From the Torah, you have to cook a fig-sized piece to violate the Shabbat, and the rabbis just added any smaller amount to try to distance ourselves from the sin of cooking on Shabbat. So it's not very much food. And already that's starting to land us in the territory, well, how do you eat on Shabbat? Well, in a way, it's like having leftovers, i.e., you make something in advance and then hold it and keep it and warm it in some way. Or you're going to make a type of food that's going to last for a long period of time on the heat. It could be something that cooks over a long period of time that you put on before Shabbat, and then as Shabbat is happening, the food is cooking so that by the time it's after morning services on Shabbat morning, it's only really ready to eat at that time. Those are the two broad families of food preparation on Shabbat. So rather than cooking it on Shabbat the way we cook it before, or we set it up before, and then once an action has been begun, we're not responsible for the continuation of that action once Shabbat has come in. So once something is already cooked, then we're done. We're just warming it on Shabbat. Or if we set up its cooking on Friday before Shabbat comes in, we're not responsible. We're not liable for the sin offering for cooking our food on Shabbat, because even though it cooks on Shabbat, the action that was taken that caused it to be cooked was taken before Shabbat. So if you cook a fig-sized piece of food on Shabbat, you're liable for a sin offering. And then he defines this to quite a number of degrees. Ehad ha'ofeh et hapat. It doesn't matter if you baked the bread. O hamivashel et hama'achal. You cooked the different type of foods. O hasamimanim, or the herbs, even a small amount of food. O hamihamem et hamayim, the person who heated the water. Hakol inyan ehad hu. Everything is the same type of activity. It's about taking something cold, making it hot, and something happening to it as a result of being hot. The interesting exception is water. Water remains water whether it's hot or cold, but in all other types of cooking, that there's some chemical reaction that occurs that is permanent. So it doesn't matter which part of it you do. You could do a different type of cooking. You could be cooking the food or just heating the pot. You could be cooking a main ingredient or a side ingredient, just warming the water. Everything is part of the labor of cooking. And then he says, Shi'or ha'mehamem et hamayim. Why is he bringing out a different minimum quantity for water? Is for two reasons. One, it has different physical properties than food. food is a solid and water is a liquid. So we need a different measurement. We need a volume measurement for a liquid as opposed to for solid volume. And the second thing is what I mentioned, that water, like either it's hot or it's not. So anytime you cause it on Shabbat, you do an action on Shabbat that results in water becoming hot, then you've cooked it, and he needs a minimum amount for that. So he says that is kedei lirhotz bahen ever katan, just enough water that you could use that amount of water to wash a small organ on your body, a small limb. One finger or something. It's actually not very much water at all. So we're learning from this implicitly that it has to have some purpose. It has to be large enough for a purpose. A big size piece of food is like a bite of food. You could get sustenance from that. A small thimble full of water is enough to wash a small part of yourself. You get some benefit out of that. Such a small quantity that you're not benefiting from it in a real way, that the rabbis forbade. And then we mentioned that sometimes if you're faced with a situation where you must break the Sabbath for an overarching concern, now you have to choose, are you going to do it in a way that violates the Torah, or are you going to do it in a way that violates the rabbis? And it's important to know the distinction, what's from the Torah and what's the rabbis. Maybe if for some reason you were going to take care of a sick person and you could do it by heating less than a thimbleful of water on the Sabbath, it'd be better to do that because you're only breaking a rabbinic ordinance rather than the Torah ordinance. So from this one little halacha, we learn many things. That any type of cooking is forbidden, that the minimum requirement for that is actually not very large. It's the smallest amount of practical use. And the person who does that is obligated in a sacrifice, which means it has very little practical application today in terms of a human-enforced consequence. We don't have a sacrificial cult, so we're not able to bring the sacrifices even if we want to. And we don't have a theocracy, and so the Beit Din is not able to make punishments for Sabbath observing. And so really it's in the hands of every individual to do the right thing and to try to observe the Sabbath, not because they're expecting a physical reward or a physical punishment, but simply because they desire to be closer to God. They desire to follow God's commandments, and they are inheriting these texts that would tell us what would the punishment be if we had punishments, or the consequence would be if we had consequences. And now it's all up to us as mature people to decide what we want to do. I actually appreciate the fact that we have the freedom to make those decisions. We have inherited the knowledge to know that if we violate them, we will be sinners at a high level. And that's between us and God. And it's actually not for another person to inform us unless we ask what they should or shouldn't be doing. Each person should have the maturity to face the set of decisions on their own. And that is the first Rambam. Now, he's skipping around a lot. There's so much material on this. We could just learn primary sources for hours and hours and hours. So I had to make a short selection of them. Here we have the fourth Rambam in the same chapter, the fourth halacha. And he's talking about the diffusing of the different parts of work over many people. Let's say if you had one person who brought the fire, another brought the wood, another set up the pot, another added the water, another put in the meat, another put in the spices, and another stirred it. They're all liable for cooking. Or anyone performing an essential activity of cooking is considered to have actually cooked. So he's saying this thing about a minimum size of one fig or one thimbleful of water applies even if you think you've spread it apart in such a way that no one person action, that any action without which you could not have completed the job is considered as though you did the entire action. So I started this saying that I was going to make it reasonable for people, and now all of a sudden we've made it very easy to violate the law against cooking on Shabbat. So where is Rabbi Melhado going with this? Well, unfortunately, what we have to do at the beginning is learn a lot about what is forbidden. And once we have a better sense of what is forbidden, we can readily understand that there are still a number of easy ways to have food preparation on the Sabbath. And it's good to know what you can't do as a first step to knowing what you can do. So just bear with me for a little bit. We do have quite a bit of material in the you can't department to cover, but I think we're going to learn a lot about the mindset that goes into understanding food preparation and our relationship with it on Shabbat. And once we learn that, we'll have a better appreciation. If I had just merely jumped into, here's how you make food on Shabbat, one and done, we wouldn't have the same appreciation as if we had first encountered the things we can't do. So those things are found in the Shulchan Aruch. This is the chief text of Jewish law, and you'll see, I believe in every handout that I've made so far, I have quoted some part of it at least one time. If not every sheet, then almost every sheet has had some quote from the Shulchan Aruch. And that is because in the generations after it was published, it came to be viewed as the authoritative summary of Jewish law. Now, we've seen that not in every case does every community follow everything that it says in the Shulchan Aruch, but what you have to do is start there, and then if your community has a practice of following another point of view, especially if it's a more lenient point of view, that community will generally have asked its Chachamim how to adjudicate that problem, and those Chachamim will go and find viewpoints from other big rabbis who have a sincere relationship with Torah that took a different stance on a halachic problem than the author of the Shulchan Aruch. And once you build up a substantial case, they will offer a counter view, which occasionally is followed in other communities. We'll see what one of those actually is in this sheet. Where it is found in the Shulchan Aruch, the food preparation, overwhelmingly is in sign 318 in Orach Chaim and in 253. There's reasons as to why they get separated like that, which we don't have to get into here. And 318 itself has any number of subparts, much more than we're going to be able to cover in this class. So I just took a selection, and now you have the source. If you'd like to be able to read it on your own, you know to find it in section 318 and 253. So let's have a look at the first part of section 318 and see what it says. If one purposely cooks on Shabbat, so that's mivashel b'Shabbat b'mezid. We saw last week, mezid means on purpose. And then there's a glossator. We're not always sure if this glossator is Rabbi Moses Isserles. Occasionally, we know for sure that it's not him. For example, if he says something and then the gloss says da'at atzmo, his own opinion, obviously he didn't write that. Some later person wrote that about what he wrote. So we assume that it's the Ramah, but if you follow a critical edition of the Shulchan Aruch, which doesn't exist yet, you may find sometimes that it's not him. But this glossator says, this rule, which we're about to learn, actually applies if you break any one of the 39 labors on the Sabbath, and not just for cooking. So if you did it on purpose, it's forbidden to you forever, right? Like I light up my burner and I cook an egg. That egg, I'm never going to be able to eat it. Not Saturday night, not Sunday, not the next Friday, not after the next Sabbath. Once I cooked an egg on Shabbat, to violate Shabbat, I'm now forbidden to eat that egg forever because I'm the one who did it. But for others, it is permitted immediately after Shabbat. So that's actually kind of impressive. You might think that because the egg itself was produced on Shabbat in violation of the Torah, that there would be some compromised nature of this egg, and that you could see the point of view that said that no one can eat that egg if they're Jewish because the egg was prepared in an environment that violated the Sabbath. But there's a mix of reality and ideal and practicality. So the ideal is that no one should be making this egg, and the practicality is that the poor egg goes to waste. And it's not my fault that so-and-so cooked the egg on Shabbat. He is a misguided person religiously or whatever. He was having a bad day and he made a boneheaded move and he cooked this egg and he did it on purpose even though he should have. It's not my fault. I'm going to now eat this egg after Shabbat because it's still a good egg. But it's forbidden to him forever. Now, what if you do it b'shogeg? That was the accidental term. That means either that he, let's say there was a hot pan somewhere and he knocked an egg into it and the egg cooked. So he didn't mean to do it. Or alternatively, he did mean to cook the egg, but he thought it was Sunday. He just forgot that it was Saturday when he cooked the egg. In either of these cases, what happens? It's forbidden on Shabbat for him and for others. But after Shabbat, it is permitted immediately even to him. So the primary difference is about whether he can eat it or not. If you did it on purpose, it's always forbidden to you. If you did it by accident, you can eat it after Shabbat. And I just wanted to compare this to the ruling in another area, 307. It's just a few simanim before. People often confuse this rule with the other. Says, if one wrongly tells a Gentile to do work for him on Shabbat, it is permitted to benefit from it only after Shabbat ends, plus the time that it would take to do the work. So if you told a Gentile, make an egg for me on Shabbat, and there was no need for it, like I need it because I'm sick, or one of the needs that we discussed in the section about trumped, Shabbat being trumped for certain reasons. If I just did it because I wanted to eat an egg and I hadn't prepared in advance to be able to eat the egg, then actually it's permitted only after the amount of time that it would take to make an egg if I did it after Shabbat. So if it takes 5 minutes to make that egg, then it's the end of Shabbat plus 5 minutes. And that's if you tell a Gentile, do work for me on Shabbat. But if we're talking about a Jew here, then whoever it's permitted for, it is permitted immediately after Shabbat, not plus the time that it makes, or that it takes to make. So that's a critical difference between who actually made the thing or not. And this applies, it's taught with regard to cooking, but as the glossator correctly points out, it's true for anything. So if you watered a plant on Shabbat and the plant got a head start in growing, and let's say it grew a nice tomato, you'd wait an extra day before eating that tomato because it was watered by a non-Jew on Shabbat and you knew that. So you give it an extra day. But if it was a Jew, then after Shabbat is over, it's permitted immediately. Okay, so skipping ahead to number 4. Now we're getting really into the meat of the issue. Completely cooked food could cook more if it was cooled. This is a statement about the physics of food preparation. Okay? Yesh bo mishum bishul im nitztanein. So if you have a food that was a hot, completely cooked food, and then it cooled down, and you came to reheat that food, the additional cooking could be said to be a new action of cooking. So even if you prepare certain food in advance and you cause it to become reheated on Shabbat, it is possible that even doing that would violate Shabbat. Now the gloss comes along and adds a very important fact. Some rule that this is only if reduction improves it. And many people follow this some rule. Okay, so if you have a food that's a liquid food, now we're already limiting it, a liquid food that is of the type that reduction improves it, and it was already cooked on Shabbat, and you put it back on the heat on Shabbat, because of the fact that further heating will cause it to become cooked more in a way that it tastes better, that is forbidden on Shabbat. Okay, we'll come back to that in a minute. Incompletely cooked food, so now it's not all done, even if it's only cooked to the level that Ben Derusai would eat it. There's a story in the Talmud about a bandit named Ben Derusai who would go along and he would wait until food was just cooked enough that you could eat it. It would be kind of gross, but it wouldn't kill you or anything, and you wouldn't be breaking your teeth on the hard, raw elements. It was just a little cooked, which they rule is about 1/3 cooked. He would come, when people were not paying attention to their food and steal their partially cooked food and eat it. And now we use that example as the minimum level of cooking that a food takes to become edible but not that nice. That means ma'achal ben Derusai's meal, i.e. 1/3 cooked. So if you have incompletely cooked food, even if it's only cooked a little bit, just to the point of being edible, it can cook more even if it's still boiling hot. So now you've heated your pot of, whatever it is, cholent or something, which we all know takes hours to make. Let's say it takes 6 hours to make a cholent. So now it's been on 2 hours. So it's boiling hot. And I guess if you put some of that in your mouth, you could probably eat it, although it would still be kind of hard and maybe not very flavorful at that point. It can cook more, even if it's still hot. You can't say now because it's hot, it's done already. And therefore, any further cooking that I do to it isn't going to cook it more. It is going to cook it more. It's not really done yet. So this is an important distinction in food preparation and food heating on Shabbat. Is it completely done or not? And also, if it is completely done, does further heating cause it to taste better? These are two factors we need to bear in mind. So completely cooked food could be cooked again if a reduction improves it, and even if something was partially cooked just to the level of ben derusai and was hot, you can cook it more on Shabbat. And meaning, i.e., if you heat it on Shabbat, you will have caused it to cook and you'll violate Shabbat. All this applies to food that cooks after cooking, i.e., that has broth. But a dry pre-cooked food may even be soaked in hot water on Shabbat. So let's take a piece of chicken. That's what it's mean by dry. It's like a block, a goosh, if you will, a block of food, a block of chicken. There's no broth. Even if the chicken has a little bit of moisture on it or a small amount of sauce, it's still considered to be dry. So if you have dry food on Shabbat, no sauce, and it's all the way done, this piece of chicken was completely cooked before Shabbat, you can even soak that piece of chicken in boiling water, which you'd think would cook it more, so to speak. But that chicken is all the way done and there's no broth, which means that further cooking is actually like if you left that piece of chicken on the heat for it to become desiccated and dried out, it would actually become less tasty. So it's done. And therefore, if you cause it to be in the same type of environment that for the liquid food would cause it to taste better, that's fine on Shabbat. It doesn't violate Shabbat because it doesn't cook it more because it's already done. So now we're starting to see some differences in the types of food. Dry foods that were not completely cooked before Shabbat cannot be soaked in hot water on Shabbat. So let's say you only cooked your chicken 50% of the way before Shabbat and then stuck it in the fridge. If you put boiling water in it on Shabbat, it's going to poach, and it will fit. It'll finish cooking. And poaching chicken on Shabbat is forbidden if the chicken wasn't already completely cooked before it was poached. So on the one hand, if it was all the way done, you can put it in a poaching environment, and you might say it's poaching right now, but it was done, so it's not going to get any more done. Whereas if it actually needs the poaching to be completed, then it would be considered to be cooking on Shabbat. So therefore, they cannot be soaked in hot water on Shabbat. They can have hot water poured over them. And then the exception is old salt preserves and a fish called Spanish tuna, since they only need minor cooking and pouring will make them ready to eat. And then the glossator says, it's probably the Ramah, the Rabbi Moses Isserles, the same is true for something so hard that it cannot be eaten without soaking. It cannot be soaked on Shabbat because this finishes its preparations. Okay, that sounds maybe bewildering and very technical, but let's pull back on it. If the food is dry and it's completely cooked before Shabbat, then reheating it on Shabbat in a permitted way, i.e. with the permitted heat source, doesn't cause it to cook anymore. So now we can think of lots and lots of dishes that we have that count as dry food, and it doesn't mean no moisture, it means no sauce. Food without a substantial amount of sauce that was all the way done on Shabbat that gets put on a hot, permitted heat source on Shabbat can be reheated without a problem. Wow. So we just got reheating for a substantial amount of the types of foods that we eat on Shabbat. And once we get into what those permitted heat sources are, we can see that a huge range of foods that are pre-cooked are totally permitted to be reheated on Shabbat. So where do we get into the problem is if the food's not completely done, which most people wouldn't do today. They would cook it all the way if they're cooking it in advance and then eat the leftovers rather than relying it to finish on Shabbat. We basically don't worry about that. Or if it's a soupy food, there's a broth to it, and that continued food causes it to taste better. There, if we take it hold a heat source on Shabbat, according to most opinions, when it heats up again, it'll start cooking more in the sense that it will reduce, and the reduction causes it to taste better. We are concerned with violating Shabbat. Occasionally, some people rule against the Shulchan Aruch. If you're from many countries in North Africa, they would absolutely put a cold liquid food on Shabbat and not worry about this desirable reduction, because there's an old Chacham from that neck of the woods who said it was okay. His name's the Rashba. And he basically allowed it, and so they follow him against the Shulchan Aruch. Fine. Okay, but for the average bear in today's society, then what we're going to do is dry foods can go on permitted heat sources, and wet foods, we try to get them before Shabbat. We try not to put them on a new heat source from cold on Shabbat. See me for some exceptions to that. There are a few exceptions that are in modern Orthodoxy, but I'm not going to, it's too detailed to go into in this class. But if you need to reheat from the refrigerator a liquid food and you are able to meet certain conditions that are signed off on by bigger Chachamim than me, you can see me, and that's so funny. Somebody is, I wonder if he's asking about that question. I get it later because I can't answer. Okay, fine. So we just made an apparently long, a little more sense. The next one talks about first vessels, second vessels, and third vessels. And I'm actually not going to say out loud because it's easier to say what the import is. I don't want to confuse people with the terminology. Perhaps I already did that on the previous Siman. This one says something very simple. If food is cooking, okay, like it's roasting in the fire, but if with a liquid broth is boiling on the fire, that is called a first vessel, and it's a first vessel from the fire. So it has been taken off the heat source. As long as it's still pretty hot, that is seen to be something cooking. So now I take an uncooked piece of food, okay, say a piece of chicken, and I drop it on Shabbat into a first vessel. That first vessel is going to cook the chicken. It's directly on the fire, or it just recently came off being directly on the fire. And we all know from practical experience, it's not like the rabbis made this up. You drop a piece of chicken into a big hot boiling pot, and you come back in a little bit, that piece of chicken is concerned when we have a pot coming off the fire on Shabbat that something we put inside of that pot is not cooked, could become cooked through its contact with the contents of the pot. So that's another issue that comes up with heating food on Shabbat, as not only do we have to be worried about the dish, but we have to be worried about foods that are able to be cooked that might enter into the dish. And now there are some levels of degree that come away from that. If you're pouring from whether it's on the fire or off, into another, it has the status of poured food, and because the stream connects back to the first vessel, we tend to take a first vessel, but it's not quite the same as tipping it into it because it does lose some of the heat through the pouring. So it's like pretty close, but not exactly